Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Bloomerang Academy. Thank you for joining us. My name is Diana Otero. I am the Product Engagement Manager at Bloomerang. You might recognize me from attending our Bloomerang Academy classes. I see some familiar names, so thanks for being here, or listening to our release and help videos. Today we're talking about Bloomerang plus Zapier, managing events with Eventbrite. I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Jessie Gilchrist. Welcome, Jessie.
Hi, Diana. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Always a pleasure to have you.
Perfect. Well, let's go ahead and, we can get started here. So, as Diana said, my name is Jessie, and I am a certified expert and Bloomerang integrations consultant at Sidekick Solutions. And so Sidekick Solutions, we are a Bloomerang partner that specializes in system automations for Bloomerang. We have been Bloomerang users since 2013, and most recently, we're a part of the Bloomerang team that launched the Bloomerang Zapier app, which is the key component of today's webinar. So let's go ahead and start talking about how we can integrate Bloomerang with Eventbrite using the Zapier app. So before we get started, obviously, for every nonprofit organization, events likely look a little bit different now than they did 6 months ago or even a year ago. I think a lot of us didn't expect how events and fundraising would change in light of a pandemic. But the principles that we are going to talk about today with integrating Bloomerang with Eventbrite work for both in-person events as well as virtual events. And Eventbrite has done a great job of really enhancing its platform so that it can be used for both types of events. So please don't feel as if the concepts we're talking about today, while we might be referring to them in an in-person event type setting, they're not limited to in-person events. You can also apply the same concepts and automation for virtual events as well. Okay. So the goal of our webinar today is to show you how a Bloomerang integration with Zapier and workflow automation with Eventbrite can be an integral part of your fundraising efforts. Today, we're going to introduce Bloomerang and Zapier, how they work together, and why Zapier integrations are a key feature of your Bloomerang system and your fundraising strategy. We're going to show you how to configure Bloomerang to track special event data. And then we're going to explore and demonstrate how you can use the Bloomerang Zapier app to create donations in Bloomerang for event payments and create interactions for event participation. Now, we have demonstrations throughout the webinar to show you how to set up these automations for your organization today. And as Diana mentioned, feel free to submit any questions during the presentation. We have a couple of breaks to answer questions throughout, and then we'll open up for more questions at the end. So as we get started, we want to start with a quick poll to see how many of you are using Zapier and how many of you are also using Zapier with Bloomerang. So let us know if you're using the Zapier app, and if you are using it, if you've used it with Bloomerang. And then also let us know if you haven't used Zapier before.
Thanks, Jessie, and thank you, everyone. It looks like about 79% of our attendees today haven't used Zapier yet, but we have 18% who are already using it with Bloomerang.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. So since there's quite a few of you that are new to Zapier, we'll just start with a really quick high-level overview of what Zapier is and why we believe it is a key feature of your Bloomerang system. So you might be wondering why we're talking about Zapier when this presentation is about automating and syncing data between Bloomerang and Eventbrite. And this is really a fair question, and it offers an exciting answer. Zapier is the software that enables additional Bloomerang integration and fundraising opportunities. It's a middleware that sits in between your Bloomerang database and other apps like Eventbrite, helping them talk to each other. So at its core, Zapier is automation software. And with Zapier, you can build one integration or many, automating hundreds of tasks around your Bloomerang system within a single platform. So if that's not enough to get you excited about Zapier and the functionality that it can bring to your Bloomerang database, let's talk through the 3 primary reasons why we get excited about Zapier. First and foremost, Zapier connects to over 2,000 other applications. Any app in Zapier's directory can be connected to Bloomerang. So if it's on Zapier's list, it can be integrated with Bloomerang, and that includes Eventbrite. So if you ever want to take a look at what other apps are available in Zapier's directory, just go to zapier.com/apps, and then you can view their list of over 2,000 other applications that are available on the Zapier platform. You can search different app categories or even search for an application by name. The second reason we get so excited about Zapier is that Zapier was designed for anyone to build integrations. You don't need to know how to code to build Zaps. Anyone can build and maintain a Zap, and we're going to walk through some builds today so you can get a feel for what that looks like. And then last, Zapier enables custom integrations. So you're not going to be limited to a one-size-fits-all workflow, mapping, or formatting. You really can build the integration that is perfect for your organization and your workflows. And especially when it comes to fundraising events, flexibility is important because events come in different formats and approaches. Now, before we dive into the specifics for setting up Eventbrite automations, we need to make sure our Bloomerang database is configured to track special event data. So Diane is going to launch another poll here real quick. We want to see how many of you are already tracking special event data in Bloomerang. So let us know if you're tracking special event data on the constituent profile only, if you're using donation or possibly interaction records. Maybe you don't remember how you're tracking it, but you do know that you're tracking it in Bloomerang, or maybe you're not tracking special event data yet. So let us know where your organization is at today.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks, everyone. It looks like 46% or 48% are not tracking event data yet, while 42% are using donations or interactions or both.
Perfect. Great. So this is a great place for us to start then today. So since we have quite a few of you that aren't tracking special event data in Bloomerang right now, we're going to spend a couple minutes showcasing how you can set up Bloomerang to track this information. And this really is the first step to setting up any automation with Eventbrite as well. So integrating Eventbrite with Bloomerang starts in your Bloomerang database. Even if you plan to use Eventbrite for all event-related actions like inviting constituents, registration, and accepting event payments, communicating with your registrants, and even tracking attendance, you're still going to want to add this data to Bloomerang. So when we think about integrating Bloomerang and Eventbrite, there's a few things to keep in mind. First is that Bloomerang should continue to be used as your constituent relationship management system, so as your CRM. And then you'd want to use Eventbrite exclusively for the process of event management. And then as your organization accepts event payments and participation data from Eventbrite, we can sync that over to Bloomerang. So it's important to keep the function of your Eventbrite and Bloomerang systems as they're intended, meaning that Bloomerang is your CRM and you're using Eventbrite for event management, but then automation is going to be the key to syncing that data from Eventbrite into your Bloomerang system. So to do this, we need fields in Bloomerang to track event payments and participation. So if you are capturing ticket purchases or even donations with event registrations in Eventbrite, these transactions should be added to Bloomerang as donations. And in order to report effectively on event income and gauge the success of different fundraising events, we need to set up some custom transaction fields. So we'll want to complete the following steps to categorize event payments in Bloomerang. First, we want to create a new campaign value for each unique event. We'll use appeals to identify the different event-related transaction categories like tickets, sponsorships, auction items. And then we'll create custom fields to classify and categorize event payments as your reporting requirements dictate. So this may be having a field for the different event types, maybe for tracking the order ID from Eventbrite as a linking reference. And again, we'll walk through all of these together. But let's hop over to Bloomerang and show what this would look like on a donation record in Bloomerang. So if we have set up our Bloomerang system for event tracking, you'll see that in here for my campaigns, I have different campaign values for my different events. So I have my 2020 annual celebration breakfast, my 2020 gala, my sandbox here has a 2020 virtual wine tasting. Again, this is new for a lot of organizations, is having those virtual events. And you can see how then when paired with appeals, we can track the different types of event-related income that we might have for each of those different events. So by using a combination of campaigns and appeals, we can report on different revenue sources for the same event. Now you can see down here on this donation record, we've also set up some custom fields to track event information. So we have set up to track different types of events that our organization offers, whether it's community, education, training, or fundraising. And then a field where we can also map and track that Eventbrite order ID, so we have a linking reference between the two systems. So now that we've talked about how we would code event payments, let's talk about how we would code event participation. So event participation is best tracked on interactions in Bloomerang. And there's a few things you'll want to consider when you set up your Bloomerang database to track who is invited to, registered for, or attended each of your events. The first question is, do you offer different types of events? So again, this is that event type field I just showcased where we were tracking whether it was a community, an educational training, or a fundraising event. You'll want to ask if you need to track the specific event that the constituent registered for or attended. And then you want to ask, do you want to track the actual participation status? So if it's a record indicating that the constituent was invited, that they were registered, they attended, or maybe even that they were a no-show. Now, all of these questions are answered using custom fields in Bloomerang. So let's hop back over to our sandbox. And let's go ahead and look at how these fields could be set up in your Bloomerang system for an event. So you can see on a new interaction record, we have our event management section down here, where we can track if the interaction is showing that the individual was attended, was invited, or was registered, the name of the event, which operates similarly to the campaign field on a transaction. So this is a way for us to pull and see who was, again, either attended or registered each specific event. So kind of serving that same segmentation purpose as we see with campaign for transactions. And then we have the same event type and Eventbrite order ID fields as we had on the transaction. So now that we've talked through the basics of how we can track special event data in Bloomerang, let's go to actually talking about how we can automate this process. So the first thing we want to do is to take a poll to see what type of events your organization offers. So do you offer paid events, free events, or both?
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks, everyone. It looks like 72% of our attendees today offer both paid and free events.
Perfect. Great. That's really helpful. So this feedback really ties into the next demonstration that we're going to walk through. So this next piece that we're going to demonstrate will only apply if your organization hosts paid events and needs to sync event payments to Bloomerang. Now, if you're one of those respondents who your organization only has free events in Eventbrite, bear with us as we'll get to logging event participation soon. When it comes to getting Eventbrite payments into Bloomerang, each new paid order in Eventbrite will first find or create a constituent in Bloomerang for the purchaser. Then we're going to use a Google Sheet lookup table to pull in custom coding based on the specific event before creating a donation in Bloomerang on the constituents timeline. Now, as we go through this demonstration, if you find the addition of a Google Sheet in the workflow to be a little intimidating, you can accomplish the same workflow without the Google Sheet lookup step. To do this, you'll need to create a separate workflow. So this workflow right here. When you create this in Zapier, you'll need to create a separate workflow for each event you host. And if you want to design your integration this way, I really recommend using one of Bloomerang's templates in Zapier. So if you go to zapier.com/apps and search for Bloomerang, or you can search for this URL right here of apps/Bloomerang/integrations. Down at the bottom, you'll see a bunch of pre-built templates for Eventbrite and Bloomerang. And so you can use those templates to get started, especially if you're wanting to not use the Google Sheet, but instead have a separate workflow for each event that you are hosting. So look at these templates if that's the route that your organization would like to go. Now, the reason why we're demonstrating the Google Sheet lookup step in this webinar is because it results in a workflow that is scalable, meaning that you can use a single Zap in Zapier for all events that your organization hosts. And so before we actually build our workflow in Zapier, we need to set up our Google Sheet. So right here, I have a demonstration of, or a sample of what this lookup sheet could look like for your organization. So before we start, the first thing we do is we set up our column headers. And so in columns A and B, we have our information from Eventbrite. And then columns D through H are the custom coding that we would want to apply for that event when we are creating donations or interactions in Bloomerang. Now, for each new event we create in Eventbrite, we're going to add the event name into column A, and then the event ID into column B. Now, the event ID can be something that might be new to you. And so if you need to find the event ID for an event that you have coming up, you can go ahead and when you are looking at your event in Eventbrite, you'll see right up here, there's this number in your URL. That is your unique ID number for that specific event. So it's a really easy way to find that is right up there in your URL. Now, I did see someone posted a question real quick about if there's a reason for a gap in column C right here. No, there is no reason for the gap. This is just kind of something internally at Sidekick Solutions we do just to make almost like a delimiter or to delineate that the data on the left is coming from Eventbrite, and then the data on the right is the coding that we like to use when, or that we will use in the integration when creating donations and interactions. So this is just a preference piece, but you can absolutely get rid of this gap in column C right here. The big piece to remember is that the data over here on the left is coming from Eventbrite, with the event name matching how your name is set up in Eventbrite, and then the event ID pulled for that event. Now, since we're going to use this Google Sheet lookup table for event payments and event participation, we need to make sure we're capturing the data that will map to Bloomerang for donations and interactions. So for example, if we're tracking participation, or if it's a free event and we're only tracking participation, there aren't any event-related payments, we're only going to need our event name and our event type, because fund, campaign, and appeal won't apply as there's no donations that are being created in Bloomerang for the free event. Now, if it's a paid event, we want to make sure that we include the fund, campaign, and appeal so that when we're creating donations in Bloomerang, it will go ahead and code those correctly for that event. So now that we've set up our Google Sheet, let's go ahead and hop into Zapier and let's set up our Zap. Oops. My Zoom menu at the top is hiding over my bar there. There we go. Okay. So when you're logged into your Zapier account, you're going to go ahead and click Make a Zap. And so this workflow starts when a new order is submitted in Eventbrite. So that's our trigger. All zaps start with a trigger, which is an event that happens in one app. And the trigger prompts the integration to run. So we are going to use Eventbrite. And we are going to use the new order trigger. I'm going to select my Eventbrite account. And then we need to customize our trigger by selecting our organization. And our event status, we want to set to all to make sure that we get all orders that come in for our events. Now, to have this workflow be scalable and work for multiple events, we want to leave this event field blank. This is where our G sheet is coming in. However, if you decide to go the route of designing your workflow to only apply for a single event and you're not using the Google Sheet lookup step, you'll want to select the appropriate event from this drop-down menu so that the workflow is only triggering for a single event. So once we've set up our trigger, we're going to click continue, and then we're going to click test trigger, which will pull in sample data. Now this will return orders created recently, and this is a sample only. It's not going to run through the integration because it was created before the integration was turned on. Zap triggers only run in real time. So you can see we have a sample order here that we can use to set up our mapping for our subsequent steps. Now, the next thing we want to do after we have our new order trigger in Eventbrite is we want to add a filter. Zapier has a great app here called Filter by Zapier. And what this allows us to do is that we want to set up a filter so that the integration is only going to continue if the order amount is greater than $0. Now, an order is also created in Eventbrite, even if it's a free event. So this filter is really important to make sure that we are only creating donations in Bloomerang for events that have a payment associated with them. So in Eventbrite, you can see that when I click over here on the left, we're only going to continue if, and then we're going to find the Eventbrite data we want to set up our logic off of. And we can scroll through and find the appropriate field. Now, in this instance, we want the cost gross major value. This is what Eventbrite calls essentially like the total amount field for an order. So we only want to continue if that total order amount, and we're going to say is greater than 0. So you can see if you test this, it's going to tell us that our Zap, our workflow would have continued because the amount for that order was greater than 0. So this, again, this filter is really important to make sure that we're not creating donations in Bloomerang for free events. We only want to create a donation for a paid event or for a paid event registration. So after we've set up our filter, we will add our first action to find or create our constituent in Bloomerang. So now we click the little plus sign and we're going to search for Bloomerang as the app we want to use next. Our action is going to be find a constituent. And you'll see that when we select this find constituent action, it also gives us the option to create a constituent if it doesn't exist yet. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to select my constituent type, which is going to be an individual. And then I'm going to map the payee's name into the search fields. And then we don't have our Eventbrite order form set up to collect address or phone number. If we did, we could map those fields in as well. But we don't have that on or set up on our Eventbrite registration page right now. It's just name and email. So I'm going to map the name and email from our Eventbrite trigger, that new order. So you can see that when it hits this step, it's going to try and find an individual constituent with the name of Stormy Gilchrist in the email of jessie.m.gilchrist@gmail.com. Now this is where we can check the box to create a new constituent if one doesn't exist. And so after the search, if it's not successful and doesn't find a matching constituent, we can create a constituent. And so same as we did above, we are going to map in the appropriate fields. to the fields in Bloomerang. So again, first name, last name, and then we know we have an email address. So I'm going to come down to the email field and we're going to map the email address. So at a minimum, when it creates that constituent record, if an existing one wasn't found, it's going to create with the name of that payee or that purchaser and their email address. Now, once we've gone ahead and mapped all of our information to the Find Create Constituent step, we're going to click Continue. And then similar to what we did on the filter, we're going to test this step. And the reason why we need to test it is because it's going to return data back to us from our Bloomerang database when it's either found or created that constituent. So you can see it tells me that my test was successful, and then it returns this whole payload of data for the found or created constituent account. And we'll need this in a future step when we create the donation. So next, once we've found or created our constituent, so now we've triggered on a new order, we've said only continue if it's a paid event, and we found or created our constituent in Bloomerang. Now we need to pull in the custom coding for that event from our Google Sheet. So we're going to pull up our Google Sheet, and we're going to use the lookup spreadsheet row. I'm going to select my Google Sheets account. And then this is where I'm going to select my drive, the spreadsheet, which in this case, we're going to get our Bloomerang Eventbrite for Academy demo spreadsheet. And then I can even select the sheet within that spreadsheet. So if I had multiple sheets in my Google Sheet, I could select which one applies. Now, once I've selected my sheet, I want to select the column that I'm going to use for a lookup. And I recommend using the event ID. And this is why we have that set up in our template here, is because the event ID is going to stay the same even if you rename your event. So as we all know, it's often that we'll first set up an Eventbrite event, and then down the road, something shifts in the name. And so we rename that event in Eventbrite. If we do the lookup on the event name, it could cause an error if the event name in our lookup sheet doesn't match it exactly. But that event ID remains static even if the name changes. So we want to use that event ID as our lookup column. And then from our new order trigger, we can pull in our event ID. And so it's going to look up that ID in our lookup column. Now, if I click Continue and I test this, similar to what we did with the Find or Create Constituent step, it's going to return the data back to us. So it's going to say, great, we looked up in your Google Sheet using the event ID. Here's all the data from that row. So we can see it's pulling all that data right back in from the Google Sheet into Zapier, so we can use that when we create our donation in Bloomerang, which is our next step. So now that we found or created our constituent, we've pulled in our custom event coding from our Google Sheet. Now we can create our donation in Bloomerang. So our action event will be to create a donation. Select our Bloomerang account, and then start mapping in our data. Now this piece here is really important. So the constituent field, the very first field when we create a donation, it provides us with a drop-down list of all of the constituents in our database. But because we use that Find Create Constituent step earlier, we can choose Custom. And then from that Find or Create Constituent step, we are going to pull in the constituent ID. Let me find it here. Right here, this constituent ID. So this is different than the account number in Bloomerang, but it's a unique ID number for each account that comes through from the Bloomerang Zapier app. So we want to map that constituent ID number so that it makes sure this donation is added to the timeline of that specific constituent. Now we'll go ahead and map the other data into our fields here. So we'll map in the created date for our order. The method is going to be credit card. It was paid by a credit card through Eventbrite. Now this doesn't process anything in Bloomerang. It just assigns it that method. We'll pull in our cost gross major value, which is the amount of our order. And then for fund, campaign, and appeal, this is where we're going to pull in custom coding. So instead of selecting a fund from the drop-down menu, we're going to pull in the custom coding from our lookup step. And so you can see I just expanded the data that was returned from our lookup step from our Google Sheet. And I can pull in now the fund that was returned for this event. I can do the same for the campaign. And then we'll do the same for the appeal. And so you can see how this becomes dynamic, that whichever event the order was for, it pulls in that information and populates it into the fund, campaign, and appeal when it creates that donation in Bloomerang. Now you have access to every standard and custom field on the donation record in Bloomerang, so you can go ahead and update any of these as you need to. For example, you could say that it's already been acknowledged by Eventbrite, so we are going to click this as yes. And then we can come down to our other custom fields that we've set up for events. So our event type, again, we have this in our Google Sheet. So I'm going to pull this from my Google Sheet step, my Google Sheet lookup. I'm going to map in my event type. And then from Eventbrite, I'm also going to pull in my order ID. Let me show you right here. So this is my order ID number from Eventbrite. Now, the reason why we at Sidekick like pulling in the Eventbrite order ID is because it serves as a linking reference between your Bloomerang system and the order that caused this event or caused this donation to be created in Bloomerang. So personally, we really like the order ID number, but it really comes down to your own preference. So now that we're done, we could go ahead and we could click continue and turn on our Zap to go ahead and start syncing new Eventbrite orders that come in to Bloomerang. Now this is usually where I do a live demonstration, but we don't want to enter credit card details live during a webinar. So I did push through a test from Eventbrite earlier today onto Stormy Gilchrist's account. And so if we go to the timeline, you can see right here that we have a donation record for an Eventbrite order. So we have the fund, the campaign, and the appeal pulled in from our Google Sheet lookup step. We have our event type pulled in from that Google Sheet lookup step, and then the Eventbrite order ID. So the ID number that's unique to that order. So before we move on to entering registrations, let's go ahead and take a couple of questions. The event payment one is often one that we get some questions on, so we want to make sure we have time to take a couple of questions right now. So Diana, have we had many questions come in about syncing event payments from Eventbrite to Bloomerang?
Thanks, Jessie. Do you have to have dummy data in Eventbrite in order to properly map it?
That's a great question. So no, you don't. If you don't have a dummy transaction in Eventbrite, it'll actually return back essentially a dummy transaction. It's mostly in Latin, similar as you'd see with old like Word templates when you'd create like a Word document as a template and it'd have Latin text in there. So it will give you a dummy transaction to work off of. However, I will say that it's harder to sometimes set up the mapping when it is the system's own dummy data. So personally, I recommend, and this is how we have set up integrations for ourselves at Sidekick, is to submit a test registration to use for your mapping, and then you can go back and refund that transaction in Eventbrite and also delete that registration once you're all set up. But for initial mapping, it will be much easier and much easier to identify which fields you're mapping if you already have one registration or order in Eventbrite to use for mapping purposes.
Wonderful. And once We have a question here. Once we are set up for integration, can we pull in data from Eventbrite to Bloomerang for events that were held in the past?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So no, so Zapier triggers only work in real time. So as soon as you toggle that integration on or turn your integration on, it'll start syncing new events or new orders, new registrations from Eventbrite to Bloomerang. The best way to get historical data from Eventbrite into Bloomerang is going to be using Bloomerang's import tool. So exporting your registration list from Eventbrite, scrubbing the data as needed, and then importing that into Bloomerang.
Wonderful. And we saw a sample here for an individual registration. Is the process very different, or would it also work for a group event with a lot of participants?
Yeah, so this workflow, let me go back here. So this triggers every time a new order comes in for an event. So this piece right here, while we're setting it up and I'm showing that I'm mapping it for, one individual, it essentially, each new order that comes in runs through each of these steps. So for each new order that comes in, the purchaser details are going to find or create a constituent and then create a donation on that purchaser's timeline. So if you have 100 different orders that come in for your event, it's going to run this workflow 100 times, one time for each order. So it does work. So if you have many participants for an event, this is exactly what it's designed for. Now for the new order, it's essentially running through one time per order. When we get to the registration and attendee check-in pieces, those ones are one time per registrant or per attendee. So one order, for example, I could log in or register for an event and buy 5 tickets, one for myself and for my 4 family members. So the order is only going to trigger once and run through once for the full order. But the subsequent workflows we're about to demonstrate that will be for registrations and attendee check-in would be one time essentially per participant. So even if there was 5 tickets purchased for one order, it would run for each registrant on that order. But yes, so Heidi, for that question, the answer is yes, this works for essentially every registration or every order for an event. It's not just one time for an event. It'll be for every new order that comes in.
Great. Thank you, Jessie. I know we have a lot to cover, so we'll come back to any questions if we have time.
Okay, so let's talk about event participation. So the next piece we're going to demonstrate is adding event registrations and attendance as interactions in Bloomerang. So if your organization does not currently use the Eventbrite check-in feature, the attendance piece won't apply to you, but the registration piece will. So when it comes to getting Eventbrite participation data into Bloomerang, each new attendee registered or checked in will first find or create a constituent in Bloomerang for the attendee. Again, similar to how we just did, we'll use that Google Sheet lookup table to pull in custom coding based on the specific event. And then we'll create an interaction on the constituent's timeline. Now we'll use the same Google Sheet lookup table we created for Eventbrite orders, which means we're ready to dive right into Zapier for setting up our workflow. So I'm going to go back to my Zapier account and I'm going to click Make a Zap again to create a new Zap. Now the workflows for creating an interaction to log an event registration versus an event attendance are nearly identical. So we're going to walk through building the Zap for logging registrations, and I'll point out where variations would occur if you're creating the similar Zap to log attendance. So the workflow starts, again, we're going to start with Eventbrite as our app, but instead of doing a new order, this time we're going to do new attendee registered. Now, again, if we were building the attendance workflow to sync when we check new attendees in, we would use new attendee check-in. So on this case, we're going to use the new attendee registered. Going to select my Eventbrite account, and then similar to how we did for new orders, I'm going to select my organization, set my event status to all, and then I'm going to leave the event blank because we're going to be using that Google Sheet lookup as a way to have this workflow work for all events our organization hosts. Again, if you want to do one workflow per individual event, you could select the event from this dropdown right here to pre-filter and only trigger for that specific event. So I'm going to pull in my sample data so I can use it for mapping. Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and dive right in, and we will be in Bloomerang, we will be creating or doing our find, create constituent step. Now this is nearly identical to what we did for new orders. The only difference is that the constituent we're trying to find or create this time isn't necessarily the purchaser. Instead, it is the registrant. So you can see that the field names are a little bit different coming from Eventbrite because it's pulling on the registrant's information instead of the purchaser's. Because we want to add the participation record onto the registrant's constituent timeline in Bloomerang and not the purchaser's. So we set up our fields to try and find a constituent, again, name and email. And then we're going to check the box to create one if one is not found. And same as we did before, we're going to map in our registrants, this time name information and email. Again, if we had also captured address or phone in our Eventbrite registration form, we can go ahead and map those in as well. Okay. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to test this step again so we get that event or get that constituent ID number that we can use to make sure that the interaction is added to the right constituent account. Perfect. So you can see our test was successful. We have our data returned from Bloomerang. Oops. Now we can go ahead and same as we did before, we're going to do our Google Sheet lookup step. We're going to look up our spreadsheet row, select our Bloom or our Google Sheets account. Oops, didn't mean to click that. Sorry about that. Okay, we're going to select our worksheet for our event lookup table. And same as before, we're going to use the event ID number as our lookup. And so we'll pull the event ID, again, in from our new attendee registered trigger, similar to what we did for new orders. And again, this allows us to make sure that when we are pulling in the coding that we want to use for coding interactions, that we are pulling for the correct event in our lookup table. I apologize if you see me keep resizing my window here. The Zoom likes to drop down the menu at the top if you go up towards the top of your screen, which is right where my tabs for my browser are. Okay, so we are going to look up the data for this specific event. You can see it returned it for us. Again, we're still working off of the virtual wine tasting, so it pulled in that same data as we saw. Now it does pull in the fun campaign and appeal for this event, but we actually won't use those in our mapping. So it pulls them in because they're in the Google Sheet, but we simply won't include them in our mapping. But now that we found or created our constituent and pulled in the details for that event for our new attendee registered, we can now set up to create our interaction. Okay. We're going to go ahead and continue. So now we can, similar to how we did for a donation, we can map our data from our previous steps to create our interaction on our constituents timeline. So I'm going to map the ID number for the constituent from our find create constituent step. And this is a dynamic field, meaning that every time this workflow runs and it finds or create a constituent, it's going to populate the ID number for that constituent. So it does it dynamically to make sure that the interaction is added to the appropriate constituent's timeline. Now we're going to pull in the created date for a registration. If we were doing an event attendance, there's actually a separate field called changed. And changed would be the date that we would want to use if we are creating interactions for someone's attendance record, because that's a different date for that trigger. So we would want to use created for our registration workflow and use changed for an attendance workflow. We'll go ahead and set up our subject. And we recommend setting up your subject to be something that says registered or attended with the full event name from Eventbrite. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull in the event name text. And I'm going to put registered as we're doing a registration interaction, or this is what this workflow is. If we were doing the attendance one, we could change this to say attended. But again, just creating that custom subject so that when you see that in Bloomerang, you know what the interaction on the timeline was for. We're going to set our purpose to special event. And our channel we're going to put as other. You could also put website if you prefer. Initiated by constituent, we're going to put as true. And then we can come down here to our other custom fields we have set up for event management. So real quickly, I'm going to pull in the event name from our Google lookup. And the reason why we're pulling this from the Google lookup and why we have this event name column is to make it that there's a standard spelling, spacing, formatting, everything for interactions created for that event, regardless of whether the event name changes. So if your event name changes mid-event, it can be hard to then pull reports, trying to use that as a criteria in a report. But if we have a static event name that's going to apply for all interactions created for that event, makes it a lot easier to then pull reports in Bloomerang. So we're going to map in the event name from our lookup table, our event type from our lookup as well. Again, we're going to map the order ID from our Eventbrite trigger. So we have that as a linking reference. And then we have this participation status field. And so for this one, we're going to set it as registered. Again, this is a way, we'll talk about this here in a moment, but this is a way to be able to pull reports really easily. So if this were the attendance workflow, you'd want to select attended instead of registered. And again, this is just a custom field we have set up on the interaction record of Bloomerang. So now that our Zap is set up, we can click continue. And we'd be able to go ahead and turn it on and start having registrations sync from Eventbrite to Bloomerang. So let's actually show how that works in real time. So I'm going to go to my sample event here and I'm going to register for it. Okay. Perfect. So we're going to go ahead and submit our registration. Perfect. So you can see now if we go back to our event page in Eventbrite and I go to my attendees, you'll see that we now not only have a new order right here for this registration, but if I go to this profile or this timeline in Bloomerang, you can see that we now have an interaction for the registration. So we have registered our 2020 virtual wine tasting. We have our purpose and our channel. And then we have all of our custom coding that maps directly there. So you can see right now in the timeline, I just have the registration record. If I go back to Eventbrite and I check in this attendee, you'll see just how quickly, if we go back to Bloomerang, and it might take a couple of seconds here, but if we refresh this timeline, you can see that now we have the attendance interaction record as well. And so the last piece we like to talk about when it comes to an Eventbrite integration is how you can use these donation and interaction records to report on the data once it's in Bloomerang. So there's a long list of special event reports you can create in Bloomerang, but a few of our favorites are, let me actually pull up my list here so you can see those. So all payments for an event, we can pull all ticket purchases for an event, maybe a list of registrants to take to a remote event via a spreadsheet to track who attends for check-in and Eventbrite post-event. Or one of my personal favorites, constituents who registered but didn't attend. So really a way to see attrition for your event. And I really can't recommend this last report enough. And I love it so much that I'm actually going to show you how to set it up yourself. So if you go to reports in Bloomerang and go to your report list, we're going to create a new report from scratch, and we're going to build an interaction report. Or sorry, actually, I lied. We're going to do a constituent report. For my inclusion filter, I want to include all constituents that have an interaction. That has an interaction, and I want to pull interactions for my event is going to be our 2020 annual celebration breakfast. And not only that, but that it has a participation status of registered. Okay, so I'm pulling in, the first thing is my inclusions is I'm going to pull in all constituents that registered for our 2020 annual celebration breakfast. And then I'm going to set up, and you can see I get my full list here. I'm going to set up my exclusions filter. So I'm going to then exclude anyone who actually attended the event. So similar setup, we're going to exclude constituents that have an interaction coded with the event name of 2020 annual celebration breakfast. And in this instance, that also have a participation status of attended. So we're including those that have an interaction saying they registered for the 2020 annual celebration breakfast, and then excluding those who also have a record saying that they attended. And so you can see I get my updated list here of my 2 constituents that registered for my event but didn't attend. So this report, again, can't recommend it enough, really gives you an actionable list where you could follow up with your no-shows, communicate with them how successful your event was, provide them another opportunity to give towards whatever cause or focus your event had, and just a great way to also see kind of what that attrition rate is for your different fundraising events. So to wrap up today's presentation, I'll leave you with a few thoughts on the power of Bloomerang integrations with Zapier. So we believe that Bloomerang is your central system and that integrations supplement your Bloomerang database and fundraising strategy. Data entry, reporting, and automation should all start from a lens that Bloomerang is the core to your donor management and fundraising technology. Eventbrite supplements Bloomerang and extends it, it doesn't replace it. By syncing special event data into Bloomerang, you can run meaningful reports on key event metrics and see a constituent's full engagement with your organization, all from within Bloomerang. So the next step is getting started. You can sign up for a Zapier account, which has a free 14-day trial, and nonprofits also get a discount. You'll then connect your Bloomerang and Eventbrite accounts to Zapier. You can grab a Bloomerang template and customize it to match your workflow, or you can go ahead and follow the workflows that we designed here today that are a bit more dynamic and scalable. Then all you need to do is turn on your Zap and monitor it. Watch as your tasks queue, resolve any errors, and high-five yourself for those successes. Now, I know we covered a lot of information today, and I really appreciate you attending. Again, this was a quick dive through how you can set this up. If you have questions, my door is always open. My email's here up on the screen. And if you'd like to work with a consultant to set up Zaps or develop a custom Bloomerang integration to address a unique use case, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to hand it off to Diana for a quick poll before we open up for more questions. But as I mentioned, my door is always open if you have questions or want to talk through other use cases that your organization has for automation.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll now. If you'd like to follow up about consulting services to set up integrations with Bloomerang and Eventbrite or other integrations that you might use through Zapier, please let us know. In the meantime, thanks again, Jesse. I know a lot of our customers and a lot of nonprofits out there are trying to get their virtual events together and are already planning their virtual events for next year as well. So this is great information if you're using Eventbrite or perhaps another platform for your event registration. We have a question here from Matt who asks if registrants have the option to enter an additional donation, would come in as one donation into Bloomerang or as two separate donations to differentiate the donation from the registration, or how does that work?
Yeah, Matt, that's a great question. So that's a more advanced integration workflow, but it can be set up either way. So it can be set up that the additional donation and the ticket purchases are on the same donation in Bloomerang and it's just a single total. Or it can be set up for those to come through and to create split donations in Bloomerang. So the Bloomerang Zapier app has the functionality to not only create split donations, to have the donation be completely separate from the ticket purchase, or you can include them as a single donation in your Bloomerang system. So there's a lot of functionality that's available and that are kind of more advanced workflows than we can cover on a webinar like this. But the answer to your question is yes, there is a way to split the additional donation off from the actual ticket purchase so that those can be coded separately in your Bloomerang system.
Wonderful, thanks. And thank you for asking that question, Matt. All right, and thank you again. Thank you so much, Jesse. It is always a pleasure having you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We at Bloomerang are very excited for this Zapier integration. We are also Zapier users ourselves, and we're very excited to see how all of you are going to use it and help you with your fundraising and help you with how to use Eventbrite and other integrations that you might be interested in. We hope that you can find a way to automate your processes and work better with Bloomerang and Zapier. So thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Bye.